Hey, this is KABBM&DDS here. A couple months ago, I made a video on the history of the Philippines, and an unexpected part of the video was extremely controversial, and that's what this video is going to be about. In this video, I'll play the controversial portion of the former video, the response I received to that, a brief Marcos biography, and my conclusions about Marcos. And I could be wrong, but this is the impression I get from what I've researched. A Philippine Republic was established, which was replaced by the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, who ruled as a dictator under martial law from 1972 until 1981, and held the position of president for over 20 years. His regime was infamous for its corruption, extravagance, and brutality. Eventually, public outrage boiled over, and in a snap election, he was removed from power and fled to Hawaii. He was replaced by Maria Corazon Aquino, the wife of a murdered opposition leader, who returned to face Marcos. She has been followed by 5 more Philippine presidents. The following is a sampling typical of the majority of the hundreds of comments I received concerning this portion of the video. A majority of Filipinos who were adults during the years that Ferdinand Marcos was in power would disagree with your views about him. They remember those days as good times in the Philippines, before the corrupt leaders that followed. Man, the thing that catches me the most is that he's anti-Marcos. So sad, never thought you would be an anti-Marcos. It kind of breaks my Filipino heart. Marcos was most respected president in entire Asian America during his term, and most genius president of the Philippines, until now. The real dictator is the Aquino family in your American politics, not Marcos. Nope, you're one of them Marcos loyalists that deny. Ferdinand Marcos is not as bad as we think. Marcos is not a dictator. He had to declare martial law to save the country. Now Duterte is here to save it again. I never really believed that the regime of Marcos was corrupted. History is always rewritten by the victors, and they slander the opposite party, making them look like the bad guys. Corazon Aquino being the president of the Philippines was really stupid in my opinion. We all know that she has no political experience and that she was just a puppet. The Philippines started to decline after that. The country was once rich, more rich than Japan once, but now look at what has happened to our country. It's tragic. You don't have the nerve to call Marcos a dictator and corrupt. He built lots of projects in the Philippines. Shame on you. You are wrong about the Marcos part. And many more comments like that. Ferdinand Marcos was born into an upper-middle-class family. His father, Mariano Marcos, was a lawyer and congressman in the Philippine House of Representatives for 6 years. In 1935, Mariano's political rival was murdered in his home by a sniper, the day after defeating him in an election. Mariano and a young Ferdinand Marcos were charged and convicted and received the death penalty 3 years after the murder. The Philippine Supreme Court overturned this ruling in 1940, determining the eyewitness testimony against Marcos that the prosecutor's case depended on was contradictory, unreliable, and had been fabricated. During this time, Marcos attended the prestigious University of the Philippines, College of Law, while being enrolled in the ROTC program for military officers. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines in the Second World War, Marcos survived the Bataan Death March, his time as a POW, and the war. His assertions that he led a 9,000-man guerrilla force against the Japanese was the most decorated war hero of the Philippines, among other claims regarding his military career, have been the subject of debate. After the war, he was elected to the Philippine House of Representatives and then the Senate. In 1954, Ferdinand met Imelda of a prominent upper-class Manila family while she was touring the Congress building, and after an 11-day courtship, where he visited her house every day, the two were married. Well-educated, connected, and politically savvy, Imelda Marcos would play a major role throughout his political career. In 1965, Marcos was elected president of the Philippines. He would maintain a very close relationship with the United States, sending over 10,000 Philippine soldiers to aid the U.S. during the Vietnam War, primarily in civilian, infrastructure, and logistical support roles. As Marcos was re-elected president in 1969, the Communist Party of the Philippines organized a new People's Army as an armed branch of their organization. Violence in the southern islands between Christians and Muslims erupted, and then a series of bombings unfolded throughout Manila. Marcos characterized these events as being part of the greater communist expansionist aims in the region, while his opponents pointed the finger at him for being responsible for the bombings, which he used as justification for implementing martial law. Demonstrations were banned and a curfew imposed. A large swath of media outlets were closed down and journalists arrested that were accused of inciting communist uprisings. A government state TV channel was created. Throughout the 1970s, the Philippine government battled communist and Islamic rebels in the country. Despite this, the economy greatly improved, and large modernization and building programs were implemented. Behind the prosperity, lower crime rates, and general law and order, many thousands were arrested and tortured, many to death, according to Amnesty International. Many Marcos supporters believe these numbers to be exaggerated, fabricated, or were justified in order to prevent an all-out civil war with the communist rebels. And although bad, prevented bloodshed on a much more massive scale, as seen in nearby Vietnam and Cambodia. In 1981, at the encouragement of Ronald Reagan, whom the Marcos is described as a personal friend, and knew before he became president, Marcos ended the military dictatorship. Marcos normalized relations with communist China, which isolated the Filipino communists as their movement slowly dissipated. Marcos granted all those carrying out martial law in any of his orders during that period of time immunity from prosecution. A new constitution was drafted, and the first presidential election in 12 years was held, which Marcos won in a landslide. However, major opposition parties boycotted the election and did not participate. During his third term, Marcos's health deteriorated rapidly due to kidney ailments and a condition of chronic autoimmune disease, and Imelda gradually took more and more of the daily running of government in her husband's stead. In 1983, a former senator who had been imprisoned for association with the communist armed insurgency a decade before returned to the Philippines from the United States, where Marcos had permitted him to travel to receive medical treatment after a heart attack. He was assassinated at the airport, despite the armed bodyguards that had been provided to him by Marcos. Imelda was widely suspected of ordering the assassination. Aquino was made into a martyr for those that opposed Marcos. Ferdinand ordered an investigation that cleared his wife of these charges. However, opinion in the international community turned against him. Many U.S. companies began to boycott Filipino products, and the capitalistic reforms and opening of the Chinese markets combined with this to cause a severe economic downturn in the Philippines. Corazon Aquino, the wife of the assassinated politician, ran against Marcos in a snap election, which Marcos won. Widespread accusations of voter fraud led massive protests, mostly centered in Manila, demanding Marcos step down. Again, Marcos followed the advice of Ronald Reagan, who said that if he stood, that there would be violent clashes between his supporters and Aquino's, and perhaps a civil war. Marcos then left the Philippines for the island of Hawaii in the United States. Afterwards, investigations carried out by Aquino's government concluded that Marcos had stolen billions of dollars from the taxpayers to fund an extravagant lifestyle. Famously, when the presidential palace was stormed by a crowd of protesters after Marcos' departure, it was discovered that Imelda left behind a collection of over 1,000, or perhaps as many as 2,700, pairs of designer shoes. Much of this collection is now housed in the National Museum of the Philippines, and was even featured in a musical about her. 3 years after arriving, Ferdinand Marcos died in the Philippines at the age of 72. I was unaware of how highly a controversial figure Marcos still is in the Philippines, until making my previous video on Philippine history. I believe at the heart of the issue is at what cost is law and order, peace, and prosperity still worth it? I believe that many look upon the majority of Marcos' time in office as a stable time where most enjoyed the fruits of economic prosperity, and a major civil war and widespread bloodshed was averted through martial law, and one decisive leader as head of state for such a long period of time. Those opposed view his clamp down on freedom of political expression and monopolization of power as inexcusable, with many believing that his time in office was a self-gratifying exercise in excess. And, as with political rivalries in many nations, you see justifications and exaggerations on either side of an issue. Marcos was alleged to be corrupt, but so was Aquino later on. There was more freedom of the press later, but then there was higher crime rates. Let me know what you think. Was Marcos a hero or a villain, or somewhere in between? Was he a net positive or a net negative for the Philippines? If you have, or know someone, friend or family, that lived in the Philippines during Marcos' tenure as head of state, I would love to read what your impressions of him are, good or bad, or mixed. Also, I've seen many people discuss in the comments whether Marcos was a dictator or not. What do you think? Does he fit this definition? Did he rule the country with total power over it? Typically one who has obtained power by force. There was martial law, but he was first elected. Was he constitutionally mandated to impose martial law and keep it for that period of time? It's a bit of a semantical exercise, but is a dictator necessarily bad? Can a dictator be good? Interesting moral questions. Anyways, this has been Epimetheus. I appreciate if you leave a like, subscribe, and if you really want to help me out, head over to Patreon, and starting at just $1 a month, you can help me out with the cost of running this channel. I would super appreciate it. Like all of these tremendously awesome folks on the left-hand side of the screen.